Thank you for joining us today, Josh.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
What I love to ask everybody when I start these interviews is that the current environmental and sustainability and climate change movement tends to not know much about social sciences or really practice environmental psychology. What's the problem in our movement when we just don't understand this stuff and we're not implementing it in the way that we design campaigns and programs?
Yeah, I mean, the problem for us would be if organizations, these collective entities that are trying to drive these climate change movements don't understand the social science, then they may not be able to effectively navigate what is trying to be accomplished. They may not be able to successfully get these groups of individuals together to take what may be better ways of acting in support of the movement. So that's what I would see as the issue there.
And your research focuses on this concept called cognitive alternatives, or being able to imagine a better type of world. I mean, what's the problem we're facing when we are not encouraging people to do this? Because, I mean, a lot of the environmental movement has been focusing on this message that something terrible is going to happen in the future if we don't act now. There really hasn't been a sense of envisaging an alternative world really taken traction much. I mean, why are we all struggling when we're not embracing this concept of cognitive alternatives and future vision worlds?
In some ways, we could think of it as having a goal that you're effectively trying to achieve. And so the cognitive alternative is how the world could be different in the future. And then perhaps more importantly, the specific steps in how that could be actually achieved. And so it requires creative thinking on the side of generating what that world's going to look like, being able to picture it in one's head, but then also thinking about how that is actually going to be achieved through some stepwise process.
Yeah, it's really quite logical when you explain it that way. And I'm also out in the field explaining it like that as well. And it's really quite novel for people. Like if anyone's watching the video, I've got this vertical forest picture in the back of my Zoom picture. And I often promote pictures of eco cities. And sometimes people think if they're like, wow, that's a really positive vision, or that's kind of like super hopeful, or is it naively optimistic? But the way you describe it, it's just having a goal and just working backwards of how to achieve that goal. It's quite logical. But I mean, why is this type of thinking, you think, so novel and unusual for our movement, which has been quite focused on talking about the problems rather than the solutions?
Well, for one, I think people aren't necessarily exposed to it. I mean, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, could I imagine your particular background? That's just not something that would even have come to my mind. And so once you're exposed to them, you can start seeing what these things might look like, as well as then subsequently generating new versions of them, generating your own cognitive alternatives that perhaps work within your own way of thinking. And our cognitive alternatives might all be different. They don't necessarily all have to be the same. You might picture what's in your background, and I might picture something completely different, but we might be moving towards the same systematic change, even with our two slightly different cognitive alternatives.
Right. And can you explain the process that you put people through in your research in a nutshell, and explain it in a way that all of us who are not familiar with social science and psychology terms will understand?
Sure. So in our research, we're really concerned with, I would say, three variables that have to do with explaining collective action. And I suppose I'll start with the importance of the collective action, because you could take independent action towards any particular goal. So if you wanted to reduce environmental degradation, there are individual things that you could do, very basic things like recycling more, having your own compost in your backyard, things of that nature. But that in my mind is not enough to really accomplish something that's systematic. To do that, you need collective action. And what I simply mean by that is that people are working toward some collective group. Now, that group in our case is probably something like environmental activists in general, or could be maybe the natural world in general. And so now you are doing things with the express purpose of benefiting broadly that particular collective that we're talking about. And so it's certainly much broader scale. And it's also, I think, much more pointed to whatever the problem that we're trying to address is. And so that's what we're trying to explain. I mean, how do we get people to go from these individual acts to collective acts? How do we get 100,000 people in Vancouver marching in support of this particular movement? And so we think, at least from the model we're working in, that there are at least three important spinning factors. One of them is that you have to view that the system should be changed. So this is what in our academic parlance we'll call illegitimacy or legitimacy. Is the way things currently are legitimate or not? And that's effectively, colloquially, we'd say, should the system be changed? Should we continue the way it currently is, where humans dominate over nature, where we're able to control it, do whatever we want with it without limits? And then we might also talk about these relationships in terms of the way that government interacts with corporations. Should corporations, say, have as much power as they currently do? So that's the first thing. Should the system even be changed, or do we think it's fine, it's legitimate the way it is? Number two is, can it actually be changed? So this is a question about what we refer to as stability. Can the system be changed? Is it ripe for that change? Or is it so stable that even if we thought the system was not legitimate, we would have a very hard time changing it? And so we don't perceive within any reasonable amount of time that we're going to make strides in that direction. And then number three, which is where we focus most of our thinking and writing, is the cognitive alternatives. And this is specifically how the system can be changed, and then what those specific steps might look like to get there. And so there's a lot of specificity involved in the cognitive alternatives part of the equation. So we have these three. We have should it be changed, we have can it be changed, and we have how it might be changed. And that's that positive vision for the future.
Right. Can you explain a little bit more about what that positive vision was? Like what type of things would you be getting people to imagine in your experiment?
Yeah, so we've done this a couple of different ways. In the first paper we designed a scale, and this was for measuring the extent to which people have these cognitive alternatives. But again, remember I told you that these cognitive alternatives can kind of be unlimited. I mean, there's not one specific cognitive alternative that's going to drive this collective action, and it might be different for different people. So we try to think about all kinds of different content areas that people could be thinking about when we ask them to think about these things. And then they would rate on this scale how easy it is effectively for them to imagine these various scenarios. So some of them are quite basic. They're about imagining a future world where we rely on exclusively renewable energies, where we don't use fossil fuels. There are items about imagining future worlds that are integrated with nature. So that would be things like your background, where we're not building on top of nature, we're not destroying nature in the process of building civilization, we're now integrating our civilization within it, so that nature and then the rest of humanity is working in tandem with one another. So that's a couple of them. We would also have ones that are about imagining the way that the status quo between government and corporations might change, or between the people being governed and the government might change. And so we can think about these alternatives in different ways. So we have the scale for that, if we just wanted to measure it. Now, then we've also tried to induce people to think about these cognitive alternatives in different ways. And we've tried this in three ways, and we found that one happens to work a little bit better, at least than the other two that we've tried. One is that we have people generate their own. And this we found is so far the best method that we've come up with. So we give people a little snapshot of what from, I suppose, our perspective, the world currently looks like. And then we ask them if they can think about ways in which the world might be different in the future. If they tell us yes, they can, then they'll get these boxes where they can type in whatever information they want, and it'll ask them to specify what the cognitive alternative is and the steps for how they believe that might be achieved. So they're thinking about their own things as they're doing it. So there's this creative element to it. And they can come up with as many as they want. If they want to come up with 6 or 12 or just one, they could do that. So, and we find that works pretty well. That works to get people to identify more with the environmental activist movement. So they'll have a greater identification with environmental activists in general. And then they'll at least specify that they're more willing to engage in a whole host of pro-environmental behaviors. And then, of course, we've also tested it in an actual behavior where we asked people if they were willing to write a letter in support of this climate change movement to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change in Canada. So that's the first way. We've done 2 others. We've tried to take, based on the responses that we've received in other studies to these questions that I just specified, we've taken people's answers and then we've taken what we think are maybe important snippets of those and provided those to people, effectively saying, based on interviews we've done with other people, here are different cognitive alternatives that people around the world have come up with. And then they read these different cognitive alternatives. And that doesn't seem to work as well as people generating their own when they're just reading others. And then we've tried to do it in a slightly different way where we show people with a little bit more visual imagery. So we showed them photographs of the sustainable city in Dubai, which is entirely self-sustaining. And then we've given a description of that as well. And I think there was one other that we used, but I can't remember the place. But that's effectively kind of showing people images like what your background looks like. And I think that's useful because rather than thinking of their own or even reading what other people are specifying the future world might look like, they're visually seeing it for themselves. And I think that probably works really well when these are actually real as well. So you show them real things that are occurring, real places that are sustainable, that look like your background, and they can say, wow, okay, so this actually is plausible. This isn't just something 100 years from now. This is something plausible that's occurring now, and that is a possible future world. It's not theoretical. It's actually can be done.
Right. So so I understand these 3 steps that a person needs to go through. They need to understand that their world is either legitimate or illegitimate. There's a sense of like, this is wrong. For example, if you think that coal mining and coal power stations aren't wrong, then you're not going to be motivated to try to imagine a different world where renewable energy is the norm. So understanding this concept of this is legitimate, this is illegitimate, then there's a sense of stability, and that really ties into hopefulness. Like you have to actually believe it's possible. Like if you're just coming up with a kind of a crazy fantasy world or something that people think is completely unviable, they're not going to buy in. So the ability of it actually being possible, and that's phrased as stability. And then you've got basically this vision of the future, which you call the cognitive alternative, which is how we'd actually get there, what this would be. I thought it was really interesting that you said that the people who, when you get them to write it down as a creative process, that worked better than the other types of experiments, which takes me into my next question, that if you were actually like designing a program, say that you were hired by a group of sustainability professionals, they were in urban sustainability, they wanted to come up with a program to help with climate change. I mean, what would be the ideal way you would support these people to try and encourage change in their communities through this type of exercise, if you had to design up a program?
Well, one, I don't think it requires anything too extravagant. I mean, we're showing that it works in something as short as a few minutes of people generating these things. But probably if you wanted to make it a little bit more effective, you could have somebody that's doing a little bit more leading, because what sometimes happens is that we ask people to generate a cognitive alternative and they might come up with something just really brief and short. Like, I can imagine a world where we use solar and wind energy or something like that, but they can't really specify how that's ever going to be achieved. And so if you had somebody else who was actually leading these in person-to-person interview format, you could ask other questions to get them to think a little bit further on it, right? Well, so how do you think that we're going to achieve that particular alternative that you've come to? What steps need to be taken? What status quo needs to be dissolved? What people need to be involved? And then that's going to help those people generate those specific steps for how to get there. And that, that makes it just more plausible. I mean, the more steps that you can think of that really are part of achieving that end cognitive alternative, I think the more inclined that you're going to be to actually go out there and do something about it.
And so I can understand your research better, did your research show that after people do the exercise, they're more inclined to take on a real behavior than if they didn't do the exercise? Or was it more that the exercise predicted what they would have done anyway, if that makes sense?
So there's
like people that are better at the people that are better at coming up with alternatives are just more naturally able to act. Because I interpreted it as once you'd done the creative imagination exercise, you were then more likely to engage in environmental behaviors than if you did not do it, regardless of what person you were before you went into the exercise.
Yeah, that would be my interpretation as well. And we've looked at it in three different outcomes that we think are important. One is the extent to which people identify with environmental activists. So this is what we call a social identity. Somebody identifies as being part of this group of people who are acting on behalf of the environment or the natural world. And we've demonstrated that when people think about these cognitive alternatives, the greater extent that they can imagine them in various forms, the more apt they are to identify more with environmental activists. And that's important because identification with environmental activists, other research suggests, is the most proximal predictor of actually engaging in pro-environmental behavior. So it's an important thing to alter if we can. Then you have the extent to which people express willingness to engage in different pro-environmental behaviors. And so we've also demonstrated that when people generate these cognitive alternatives, then they express more willingness to engage in a whole host of pro-environmental behaviors. Now, we're not actually to the behavior part yet, but being willing to do something is at least of a precursor to actually doing it. You're less likely to do it if you say, well, I'm not willing to do it anyway. So the more we can get you to say that you're willing to do it, the more likely you will actually do it in the future if these opportunities arise. And then the third is measuring actual behavior. So finding ways in studies to give people the opportunity to actually do some kind of pro-environmental behavior. And the way that we've done this so far is that we allowed people, we asked them, do you want to write a letter to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Canada, who at the time was Catherine McKenna. And if they said yes, then we gave them a page where they could type up their letter. And then we gave them an extra step to see maybe just how committed they were to this, where we gave them an opportunity to sign their letter. And before they opt into doing this, they're expressly told that we're actually going to compile these letters. And we did. We compiled these letters and we mailed them off to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So they knew that if they wrote the letter and then subsequently if they wanted to sign the letter, that these were actually going to be in the hands of that particular office. And I think this is a good collective action behavior because it specifically works to alter the status quo. If you're putting your voice down on paper, you're trying to build a critical mass and subsequently trying to get the minister to enact particular policies that support this movement that you do support.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting in your study that you're very clearly delineating between individual behavior change and collective action, because this comes up for me all the time, and I find I'm explaining it or kind of working in it every single day, where people will criticize or they'll question the environmental behavioral science and say, why are we trying to get people to do individual behavior change when we really need the system to be changed? And it's a very like overly kind of like simplistic criticism, but it puts me in the position of needing to explain how small individual actions that people take do lead to two bigger ones. And so in the way that you framed your study is not so much testing, because I read these studies a lot, and sometimes they'll test if somebody like reuses a cup or do they recycle. They're testing these very simple psychological prompts on behaviors. But you chose a behavior that is how to influence the system. I mean, was there a reason why you leaned your research towards trying to influence the system rather than trying to test if people like increase their recycling by 20% since doing it?
Yeah, I would say there's two reasons that we went that route. The one is that the theoretical model, that the background that I come from as a social psychologist, is a model of systemic change. And I started doing research within this particular theoretical model prior to ever getting involved in research that had to do with the environment at all. So I started from that point and then continued to adapt the way that we thought about this model within different contexts. So part of it is just that was my background. And so it made sense for me to continue within, to some degree, the same line of thinking that I'd been doing for years. And then the second is that the special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out in 2018. And this was around the time that I was getting involved in this line of research. And they make I don't remember the exact quote, but they make a specific claim in there that we need systematic change in order to solve what they refer to as the climate crisis. And so that becomes a good lead-in when you have this panel saying, look, we need individual acts, not going to solve the problem. We need systematic change. We need to alter the status quo, that is the way that things currently work, the system that's in play between people and the environment, and between government and people, between government and corporations, and so on.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting and worth saying that getting people to engage in writing a letter or turning up to a meeting, like, it is a behavior. Like, all of the behavioral science that we look into about social norms and encouraging actions, even like the gamification stuff that I do, trying to get people to give stickers or stars or something to encourage behaviors. I mean, it doesn't really matter what kind of behavior you put in there, the same stuff still applies. However, the type of agency we're trying to encourage in people when we're trying to get them to involve in these bigger systems, I think it takes more thoughtfulness in giving people, in terms of group behavior and identity and agency. Like, I get a sense if I'm using my reusable coffee, I'm going to Starbucks and I'm taking my plastic reusable cup with me, I have a sense of agency over that cup. Like, I know that it's my waste and I feel a sense of responsibility over my singular cup. And I kind of feel it matters because I know that if I didn't use it, that cup wouldn't be there, right? But if I'm turning up to a meeting or writing a letter, like, I'm not going to be motivated to do that if I don't genuinely feel that I'm having a sense of agency over the system. So I think when we are actually designing for these systems interactions from people, there's a sense that this letter writing or this political engagement can be just really forgotten and really empty. I mean, honestly, like, I've rarely, if ever, done anything like that because I just didn't think it would work. I didn't think I would have an impact. So how does your research into these imagination exercises help encourage that sense of agency with communicating with politicians that can easily feel like you're just kind of throwing things into a black hole? Like, how does it make that no longer a black hole, the light? How does it make the light?
I think probably that it's if you can show people or get them to think of, again, plausible cognitive alternatives, ones that really have a chance of coming to fruition, then, and they can come up with these steps of how to achieve that. I think it solves the problem you're talking about, because people see, hey, this is already being done. This isn't something that's 100 years out, that's theoretical. This is something very plausible that's already happening. I can be part of helping that either happen faster or happen at a greater scale. And so they're seeing that other people who maybe have taken steps toward making these cognitive alternatives come to fruition have in fact been successful, at least in some cases. And so that probably kind of intuitively tells them that, well, if I do some of the same things, then that's also going to help. There is actually going to be a finish line. There's going to be an environmental prize at the end of it, so to speak.
Right, right. And you mentioned before that group identification is one of the most strong predictors of people taking action. So I'm thinking, if I'm designing a program like this of getting people to engage in these exercises and do some actions, I really need to provide some extra padding around kind of nurturing this sense of identification. Can you talk a bit more about identification and how we could, like, if I'm in the field trying to figure out how to kind of manifest more of this, how I could do that?
Okay. If we think about social identity as being that part of an individual's identity that stems from their membership in social categories, regardless of what those categories are, they could be a category of environmental activists, they could be the category nature, they could be the category of professor for me, whatever the way in which we categorize ourselves is. And what social identity does, I mean, the more that we identify these particular categories, the more likely we are to engage in behaviors that benefit that particular category that we belong to. It's like saying, hey, these are my people, right? This is my group. These are the people that I care about, the causes that I care about. I identify with all the different nuts and bolts that make up this particular category and what they believe and so on and so forth. And so you're going to act in ways fairly automatically that are going to protect that particular category or raise the status of the category. So if we're talking about a lower status group, which in the context of our research would be nature, the more you identify with nature, the more likely you would want to subsequently then protect nature in whatever ways that you can. And then the other one, the identifying with political activists, I suppose I'd say that we think about two identities that come up in our line of research. You have identification with nature, which is a very broad-based category. And then you have a slightly more specific one, which is identifying with political activists, specifically environmental political activists, or something like an environmental activist movement, however you want to word the identity. And one of them has a stronger relationship with these pro-environmental collective behaviors than the other, and that one's the identification with environmental activists. And that's because that's a particular category that expressly states how somebody should behave. And then those ways that somebody should behave end up being all these various pro-environmental behaviors that one could engage in. Identification with nature is much more broad-based, so it does to some degree, the more you identify with it, lead you to want to protect nature a little bit, but it's not as specific. It doesn't lay out how you actually go about doing that. That's where the identification with environmental activists come in. So we can think of it kind of, if we thought of it as a causal chain, we'd have something that looks like identification with nature causing to some degree identification with environmental activists, and then the extent to which you identify as an environmental activist is subsequently going to cause the pro-environmental behavior. And then the cognitive alternatives and the two other, the instability and the illegitimacy parts come in, because these three things help both induce the pro-environmental behaviors, but also induce the identification with environmental activists, which then again helps us explain the collective behaviors.
Right. So it's kind of like a master umbrella, or kind of like nesting of social identities. But I think people tend to assume that the reason why people act is because of just the earth, like it just matters, and we're doing it because of the earth. But every single thing I read, the earth is like the least motivating factor in what actually drives people to do stuff. And what you're saying, it's to do with our social identification with the group is the most powerful thing about us that gets us to act. Like, we're not just an island that just like reads about a glacier or a tree and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to like act completely independently of my own intellectual volition over this issue. We're really like trying to get more liked by the group, trying to increase our status in the group. We've got a certain amount of social cohesion that bonds us with this group. So in terms of engaging in these actions, it's really looking at it through the lens of the group behavior is really kind of what's really going on. And that's the way we need to think of these things. And I see that really missing in the line of work. We're all like, how do we get individual people to act? They only do it because of money. It's this overly very, very simplistic view of human behavior. But we have to try and think about how we get groups to do things. I mean, what are your thoughts on groups and how we can encourage groups and why groups of humans matter when we're seeing things, as opposed to we're all just individual islands, just many of them all stuck together?
Well, groups matter because they give us what I would call effectively group-based positive self-esteem. I mean, when our groups succeed, when our groups achieve things, that makes us feel good about ourselves because we were part of that process. We were part of the members that helped achieve whatever the particular goal was. And groups do give us specific goals, right? If we're part of an environmental activist movement broadly, or even a more specific group, if there's some particular environmental organization that somebody really likes and is an official member, they pay their monthly contribution or whatever it is, that gives them, again, a greater sense of self-esteem that comes from being part of the solution. So how do you get people to identify? If we wanted people to identify more with the activist movement, we've got to show them that there is in fact something to be gained from doing so. You got to make it easy to join the group. What we would call permeability. Is a group boundary permeable or not? It needs to look like something that somebody would actually want to join. So in some sense, that kind of means to me that a group can't be too serious. Like people want to have fun in groups. Not everybody, we don't want our groups to be all work and no play. So you might be able to get people into a movement because you're getting them to join a particular organization, which is its own social category, and that's a pro-environmental organization, let's say. And they may not even be joining because they really care about the environmental movement. They might be joining for some other reason, maybe because your new members get a free whatever, some object, a bag, or I don't know, something that they would be desirable for them, I suppose, even if they weren't pro-environmentalists. But once they're in the group, you start meeting people, right? You start building relationships with people. You start feeling, as you said, that sense of camaraderie between the group members. You start the group, presumably from the leadership is going to start dictating what particular goals might need to be achieved, reaching particular levels, let's say, of could be something like collective consumption. Like I know you've got all these apps that have to do with tracking how much energy use people have and so on. Well, the use of that is that it creates goals. And so if you have a group that's decided that you're going to meet some specified criteria, there's an incentive there as the group to meet it. And as you meet those goals, you get greater self-esteem as a member of the group for having completed something together. And you also build camaraderie with the members of the group as a whole. And so you can start small, you can build that collective up over time until you get to whatever higher level collective behavior that you think is most important for achieving the various cognitive alternatives that you've come up with.
Right. So I could host like a barbecue or something, but I wouldn't do it. It'd have to be a vegan barbecue, like a Sunday, like an ice cream party, right? And I've got kids, so kids love ice cream. Not trying to go too harsh on the whole environmental climate change, let's change the world thing. Maybe it's like a subline, like ice cream party, and we care about the planet, vegan ice cream. And I can get families and people in my neighborhood around. I know that the subtone is like an environmental kind of theme. And then in this group, I can say, thanks for everybody. Like we got like 20 flavors of amazing vegan ice cream. Thanks for coming. Kids are playing. Let's chat about some stuff. And then in that, I'm starting to create kind of like a group. And I'm saying, well, we're going to use this group we want to increase the amount of like solar that's installed in our neighborhood. We want to get perhaps the whole city off natural gas. I know all the cities are trying to do that right now. And we also want to make sure this new climate bill gets through the Senate. And so we're trying to get a couple of hundred people to write some letters. And then we become like the neighborhood, like Earth ice cream group, fun, very easy, what you say, very permeable, easy for people to access, not aggressive, but it's leading to a very like specific goal that's actually quite hard hitting. Like if we can get funding to happen or influence the mayor more than just using less plastic ourselves and trying to create some big systemic changes, that's like that group cohesion with a group goal and us working together with a group goal is enormously more powerful than if you were to just ask me by my individual self to just do this stuff. And I've actually got it here. I copied it from your report that says, or your paper that says, group identity increases efficacy. So the more I identify with this group, the more efficacy I have. Can you just explain what the word efficacy is? Because I see it a lot in psychology, and I think it's pretty pivotal to our conversation.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is that the more you identify with the group, the more control you feel that you have over the group behaviors. The more control, the more you believe that you and the other group members are able to dictate the various outcomes. And so I think that's certainly important for achieving any kind of behavior, not just collective behaviors. But
is efficacy and agency the same thing? Do they mean the same thing?
I don't know. That sounds like a dictionary question.
Well, sometimes with psychologists, like they mean totally different things because you guys go into like so much detail in what these phrases mean.
I think I'd have to go back and see how all the various sectors are defining things. But there are certainly funny cases in academia where different groups of people will use different words for the same thing. And then over time, you'll realize you've been studying the same thing as somebody else. You've just been calling it something different.
Yeah, well, you should see some of you probably do see them, like the titles of these studies I look through in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. I'm just like, who could possibly understand what this sentence means? It's like so complicated. I saw actually a post on Twitter that said, explain your PhD as clickbait. And it was it was so funny. Like people were just like top 5 ways to whatever. But I just wish that the academic papers were titled as clickbait titles, so at least I would understand what they meant without taking 30 minutes to figure it out.
I mean, even ours is not. It's pretty esoteric, right? I mean, measuring cognitive alternatives to the environmental status quo.
I will write
how many big words can we put in the title?
Well, that's why I'm here. When I write up this blog post, it will have a super clickbaity title, and then I'll try to get lots of people to look at it, and it will be easy to understand with a little glossary of all the terms.
I think the issue is that when we publish in journals, if we wrote a paper and described it as that we're studying whether something should be changed, whether it can be changed, or how it can be changed, they're probably not going to publish our paper.
Right. A little academic world of everybody trying to impress everybody. I do wish though that the academic world was, I know everybody's trying to kind of impress everybody in the academic bubble, but there was another version of incentive that it also mattered how much you managed to impress several thousand other people out there who are actually practicing it, which I know sometimes it's looked down upon in your world. If you're actively blogging and podcasting and getting out there, you can possibly be seen as not as serious a scientist. Is that true?
I think that's changing. I mean, I think that certainly would have been true 20 years ago, but I think it's changing. I think that researchers, academics want more visibility to their work in the public. So, and even schools, I mean, my college, for example, looks very favorably upon these sorts of engagements, right? That there is what they would call public outreach, and that we're not just publishing in journals for other people like us to read, because readership in academic journals is quite low. You might be the only non-academic that's ever read our paper.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit that way. I mean, even when I'm looking up the authors to try and interview, some of them don't get back to me because they literally only have your email address, and the authors have such a low profile. I can't find them on LinkedIn. I can't find them on Twitter. And I'm like, who are these people? I can't even tag them. A lot of the time, I literally cannot tag the author on Twitter of the work that they've done, which is fascinating and super useful. So there's a real absence of any kind of systems or a culture or an actual practical real incentive or program. There's no reason why the academic journals couldn't have another parallel process of people like me who work with people like you and are cool, academic paper, let's turn it into all of this material and try and distribute it for wider consumption, that it couldn't be doing both simultaneously all the time. I don't know why it's not designed that way. You just
there are
laugh. Just laugh. No answer. Just.
Yeah, there are lots of things that I can tell you that are wrong with the way that academia is structured.
Yeah.
And the incentive system that's in play. But
okay. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad that the studies are there, and there are people like you doing the hard research that I can learn from. Okay. Well, let's go into our next question. I just wanted to dive a bit more deeply into this idea of stable versus unstable realities. So your research shows that when we are, wait a sec, maybe I'll just let you try and explain it. What do you mean by a stable reality versus an unstable reality, and how we need to work with that with our visions of like the current world and the future world?
So the way that I position the idea of stability of the system is that two things in tandem. I mean, if you view a system as stable and or view it as legitimate, then there's less incentive to go about imagining various cognitive alternatives. Like if I looked at the current world and I said, the way that it's structured in terms of this relationship between humans and the rest of nature, or between government and corporations, government and people, et cetera, is stable, I'm saying I don't think there's a very good chance that this system's going to be changed, at least anytime soon. So there's kind of a time component to it. I might in fact believe that it can be changed in the long run, but if I'm thinking down the road and I'm thinking 50 years from now, then I'm also thinking, well, I'm probably not going to be around in 50 years. And so why would I imagine a different world and then work toward achieving that different world? That's so far into the future. I think our brains work on a smaller time scale, right? What can I do today that maybe is going to affect how things are next year or in 5 years or something like that? And so for stability, it's really about whether there's an incentive to go about thinking about a future way, a better way of doing things. And I think that not entirely, but to some degree, you need to view that the current system can in fact be changed in some limited time frame where it becomes reasonable. What that is, I don't know. Maybe that's 10 years, maybe it's 15 years. And we've actually run into problems in our studies when we try to measure stability when we don't put a time frame. I think in fact the paper that we're talking about, the first study, I think we didn't have a specification of the timeline at which somebody thought or didn't think that the current system might be changed. And then we changed it and we put in a 15-year time frame because we thought everybody thinks the system can be changed if you give them unlimited time, right? It's like, is the world going to look the same today or in 100 years as it is today? Nobody's going to tell you yes to a question like that. They know that it's going to change, but that time frame is so far out. And I'll go a little bit further because I think it's important to think about the way that especially these three concepts interact. Generally, the way that I've originally, and still do to some extent, that I think about how the illegitimacy and the instability and the cognitive alternatives are related to one another is that you view the system as unstable, or you view the system as illegitimate, and that drives the generation of these cognitive alternatives. We're always talking about groups. I mean, this whole model is a group-based model. And so within groups are almost exclusively hierarchical in nature. I think you'd be hard pressed to find real world groups where everybody's equal status, right? There's leaders and there's followers, and there's different people with different degrees of status in between. Leaders have the ability to help to present cognitive alternatives to individuals. So simplistically speaking, imagine I'm a person in a group, and I in fact believe the current system is maybe quite stable. It's unlikely to be changed in the near future. And I also, maybe to some degree, believe the system's relatively legitimate. Like, I do believe humans are the highest level of being, and that maybe I think it's right that we have more control over the way things work, and that we might degrade the environment to benefit ourselves to some extent. If I'm in a group, a leader could present an alternative way of doing things. They could show me these images, right, these future worlds, say, well, even though you think the current system is stable and you think it's legitimate, I actually think that you might find there's a better way. And then if they show you that better way, you might then start viewing the current system as a little less legitimate, as a little more unstable. Like, oh, I didn't think it could be changed, say, in the next 15 years, but now I have this person in my group who's showing me ways in which it might be, ways in which we could plausibly achieve these things. And so now the extent to which I view the current system as stable might decrease. And the function of that is that these things are interacting with one another, right? The cognitive alternatives could come first, the illegitimacy and instability can come second, or it could be the reverse. That absent the leaders, then the illegitimacy and instability come first, and then you get the cognitive alternatives after.
Right, because I think that's a really interesting way to look at it, because, and it's a lot more nuanced in terms of how we're trying to tell the story than just good and bad, which is kind of the way I was thinking of it. I was like, fossil fuels and the current world system is bad, and the eco-utopia where we've all figured it out is good. So that's just obvious and we should go there. There's a lot more subtlety in how we're trying to tell these stories if we're trying to actually erode the sense of legitimacy and stability, rather than just saying it's got pollution and climate change is bad. We're really trying to get into the nuance of this petroleum, and I'm just thinking of cars as an example, freeways, petroleum-based cars, oil extraction, really trying to tell the story of a sense of this is an unstable system, like it's going to run out, it's able to change. It was only built fairly recently in human history, so it can also actually just go away. We don't have to accept it as being normal. And it's illegitimate in the way that it's been designed. It wasn't really democratically designed in terms of the way cities and corporations got together and paved everything. We didn't all come up with it. That is illegitimate and it's unstable. And this other world where cities are designed more for people, more for nature, with renewable energy. The sun is going to be around for a very long time, longer than fossil fuels. That is actually the stable world. That is both legitimate and stable. And I think if I was having to curate or write or illustrate two different stories through the lens of stability versus instability and legitimacy versus illegitimacy, I would do it just a bit differently than just this simple lens of good and bad, which even good and bad is a little bit further than what we've been in, which is just bad.
Even so, I mean, the good and bad, we talk about cognitive alternatives, and I haven't explicitly stated this, but the alternatives that we talk about are generally positive. We don't spend any time in our paper discussing the visions for the future. And one I think interesting thing about that is when you telling people that, let's say, the world currently, or we're going down like a negative trajectory, right? Things are bad now, things are getting worse. That doesn't necessarily undermine views of stability or views of legitimacy, because you could reasonably look at a system and say, yeah, the system's no good, but also I think it's stable, it's unlikely to be changed, and I think that at least the status quo within the system is legitimate. And so showing people the way things are bad doesn't necessarily work, or at least doesn't work very well. Whereas when you show people the positive visions for the future, you show them a better way of doing things than the current system. Even if you think the current system is pretty good, right? If I go, hey, I'd give the current system an 8 out of 10. Well, there's still room for improvement. And so if you can show groups and individuals those alternatives that improve on the current world, then there's an incentive to then think that, okay, the current system can actually be changed, and there's a better way, there's a more legitimate way of doing things.
Right. It's a really important nuance that I think that if you show people basically all the bad stuff that is happening, we can all agree that it's bad. But if we agree that it's so stable, it's unable to be fixed, we'll lose that efficacy/agency that might get us to change. So just talking about how everything's terrible doesn't necessarily encourage any sense of agency, because we're like, oh, it's stuck that way. Whereas if we are using the vision of the future, the solutions, the cognitive alternatives, what that does is actually corrodes our faith in the current system. We no longer accept it as being this stable system or having faith in it. And I thought that was really interesting in your research. Can you tell me about the BBC prison study where they did something, they corroded the faith in the current system?
Sure. So the BBC prison study, which I think is 2006, what they did was they created a mock environment in which it was designed as a mock prison, and people were randomly allocated to be either guards in the prison, so that's the high status group, or prisoners in the prison, and that's the low status group. And you effectively start off by creating a system that looks somewhat like a real prison environment. The prisoners are going to be locked up, they'll be let out for free time here and there, they'll have their meals that are going to be adequate but not good by any means, and so on and so forth. And then you naturally watch what the progression is. And part of the natural progression that researchers saw in the BBC study was that over time, in time, I mean a matter of days, I think we're talking about 6 days total in this context. In the first couple of days, what you see is that the prisoners begin to build camaraderie with each other. They begin to form a group. That is, that they are linked together. They have similar goals, and that goal turns out to be to improve their status as prisoners within this system, to get more free time, to get more cigarette smoking breaks, to get better food, and so on. And so what you see is their social identification increasing over the course of the days while they're in their study. The other thing that you see is the extent to which they can imagine cognitive alternatives increasing over the course of days as well. As they're communicating with each other, they're talking about ways of improving the current system, they're spreading that information, right? They're showing each other effectively what a future world would look like in a few days' time. And that actually drives them to action where they effectively overthrow the guards, not violently, this is all through negotiation, but they overthrow the system, and then they effectively sit down with the guards and try to come up with a different system to use for the few remaining days of the study. So you see the identification going, and you see the cognitive alternatives increasing as well. And then what the researchers did at one point, I think it was on day 2 or 3 or something like that, they'd originally not really predicted that the cognitive alternatives were going to happen automatically, which they did end up occurring that way. And so they'd actually designed an experimental manipulation by which they would plant a new prisoner into the system. And this person was chosen specifically because they were a trade union organizer in their real life. And they thought, this is the kind of person who's going to go in, who's going to think about ways of changing the status quo, and in fact, generating these cognitive alternatives, going to get the other prisoners to see that and show them a stepwise way that they could do this negotiation and alter the status quo in the system. And so he did that, and you ended up seeing that to some degree play out in the BBC study. Ultimately, they designed a new system, which the researchers described as a commune, and then there was infighting over the commune, and then they dissolved the study because they couldn't effectively negotiate the way that they wanted the prison to run after that.
Okay, so what we can learn from the study is that if we imagine another possible world, we can all organize, get our way, but then we fall into a disarray commune if we don't manage it. I think that's happened in the real environmental world many, many times already. We've got to figure out the next step. But you mentioned leadership earlier, and it also talks about in your research this idea of what a leader is, a leader having a vision, phrases like who we are, what we might become. Can you talk a bit more about the role of the leader and the cognitive alternative in the group?
Yeah, I think that the leaders in groups are the people who are able to show that future world to the other group members. It's the leaders that effectively dictate the goals, what kinds of things the group is going to be dedicated to. And usually the way leadership works is there's a relationship between what we call prototypicality. There's a relationship between how much a given individual in the group looks like the ideal group member, and the extent to which that group member is respected by other group members. And so usually the way you end up being the leader is you're the leader because you're the most prototypical member or one of the most prototypical members of the group. You embody the whole of the group. You embody all the values and the traditions, right? All the beliefs and so on, the norms of the group. And because you effectively embody the ideal group member as best one can, you then are ultimately the most respected or one of the most respected people in the group. And so that's important because if the leader is going to effectively be showing these cognitive alternatives and what the group can do to try to achieve these cognitive alternatives, it's useful that the leader is in fact respected. When a leader is not respected, in part because they're no longer prototypical, they're maybe doing things that are against what the group norms are and the group values and so on, they'll become more disrespected, and then people maybe would not take as seriously the cognitive alternatives that may be presented by that particular leader.
Right, but it made me think of the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, which I used in my TED talk and in my talks a lot, that just how critical it is, not just that we have a dream, but that is the role of a leader. If you're a leader in a community group or you're a CEO or any type of group that you're in, it doesn't need to be like big L leader, like politician. Many of us are small leaders in little groups that we're in. That your role with that group is basically just having a goal and being able to illustrate that vision. Like that's a core role in leading a group and how change happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, the leaders in groups are typically the visionaries.
So what do you think about Greta Thunberg? Greta Thunberg would be considered to be a leader, but what she talks about is just a very, very scary future. Do you think she's doing a good job talking only about the very scary future as opposed to the alternative world, the good world that we could have?
So I suppose two things that I'll comment on her. One is that I think the approach and the approach of talking about the gloom and doom, as you've called it, is not a good way of presenting solutions to people. And maybe that's for two reasons. One, you have what I've already mentioned, where if we look at the world and its trajectory and we see it as bad and we see it as getting worse, that doesn't necessarily influence our projections of stability and illegitimacy. I mean, you could very well think that the system's stable and that it's legitimate, even if it's not as good as you want it to be. You may not perceive that it actually can be better. So it's kind of like, oh, well, the world's terrible, but it is the way it is. So we're not maybe generating the things we need to be generating to get the collective action that we want. And two is that I think that the negative visions for the future, the other problem with it is that these are predictions that may or may not come true in the future. And if you look at the history of these kinds of negative predictions, if you look at typically your pro-environmental individuals, I'll use Paul Ehrlich as the example, the biologist who wrote the population bomb. He's a doom and gloom guy. The world's going to fall apart if we don't start, one, reducing the population, but also reducing our overuse of the resources. And I think his number was that the world could sustain something like 2 billion people. And once we surpass 2 billion people, you're going to see mass famines and millions and millions of people were going to die off. That, of course, never came to fruition because people are visionaries. People are developing technologies. We have, for example, better yields today in farming than we have in the past. That's based on technology. That's based on altering seeds and so on, tools in farming that yield to get better yields and so on. And so the problem with the negative predictions are that they often don't actually turn out to be correct, in part because we do things to prevent them. But then what that enables is if I'm somebody observing and I look at the predictions, well, I could go over and over again, well, you keep predicting this and it never comes true. You keep predicting the doom and gloom and it never comes true. right? You keep predicting the mass starvation, it never comes true. You keep predicting the complete decimation of cities because of rising tides and so on, and then it never comes true. And so it's a way to, I think, enable the hand waving. You could say, no, what's the point of listening to these guys? They're always wrong. They never predict accurately. And I think that's just an issue with predictions in general, is it isn't true that the world is going to be underwater in 30 years. That may be a prediction that some particular environmental figure thinks may be true, but it may not come to fruition, and probably it won't come to fruition if we pay attention at all to the history of these kinds of claims.
Well, if you hear the real climate scientists talk about it rather than the activist types who often are authors or activists, you do get a more balanced approach of people saying that there's multiple directions it could go. This is one scenario, which is very frightening. Then there's a middle ground scenario, which is there is warming and some ecosystems will be affected and some bad things will happen, but it's not going to be the entire earth is on fire and we all die. And then there's another possible way, which is we actually really figure out our way out of fossil fuels reasonably rapidly, and we don't see much catastrophic warming at all. So I find that if you listen to the people that really have the PhDs and really look at the scenarios, they'll give you the more balanced approach of, is it going to be A, B, or C, depending on what we do, rather than the kind of like the hyperbolic, scary predictions. But what concerns me and what fascinates me about this issue is I see a lot of people in a very deeply distressed, overwhelmed state to do with climate. I mean, I don't personally feel that way, but I do remember feeling that way when I was 16. I was like Greta Thunberg, freaking out, and people typing things on Twitter that are just like dreadful, like I'm never going to have children, we're all going to die, like I've just been depressed for weeks since I read some book on climate change. Like I don't see that particular emotional overwhelm. Perhaps it's a necessary emotional process to go through, but that doesn't seem to be the thinking that is going to get us where we need to go. And when I see the other lens of looking at the amazing possible future, the solutions, the creativity and the imagination it takes to create that world, I see that as hatching open the kind of epic innovation that we're going to need. Like often change is talked about in terms of individual changes, like recycling more or riding your bike, and then like systems changes as affecting the political system, like writing letters and changing laws. But there's a whole other thing going on, which is the massive amounts of innovation that it takes. Like it takes an enormous amount of engineering and designing and problem solving to actually figure this stuff out. Like, how do we build all these buildings? Like somebody had to design that and figure it all out. They had to measure how much the trees weigh and how much concrete it needed. And there are people trying to figure out how to build skyscrapers out of wood. Like there's just so much nuanced design. And that's something that's not going to happen overnight. That's like decades of work. Like the guy who invented the green wall, Patrick Blanc, I mean, he spent his lifetime trying to figure out how to build these giant green walls, and then he shares it, and now they're going up everywhere. I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of like trying to move even beyond systems influence, but into this long-term innovation in terms of the mind space it creates for people that's an innovation-based problem-solving mindset versus this, I think it's a really tragic emotional overwhelm that people can get stuck in, especially young people now?
I would say that technology is amazing, innovation is amazing, and that's part of the reason why I'm certainly not one of these subscribers to the doom and gloom scenarios, not because they're not possible futures. They could be possible futures, but because humanity always seems to have this knack for overcoming challenges and creating new ways of doing things that are better than the ways we've been doing them in the past. So I suppose I'd say that I have faith that all the engineers and other people that are involved in these sorts of things, they're gonna make these imagined alternatives come to fruition. And maybe that's 10 years from now or 20 years from now or so on, but it'll end up happening, and the doom and gloom scenarios I don't think will end up happening for that reason. So
yeah,
I think it's like hope at the end of the tunnel. I mean, the vision is there. And even if we don't have the steps to get there right now, there are all kinds of great minds at work creating the things we need in order to create these future worlds.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope in my lifetime I can play a role in trying to hatch that open in people. Like people have a little Easter egg inside them, and I can just be like, it's possible. Like you can come up with great ideas and you can innovate. You don't need to just live either a distressed, overwhelmed life or a life where you don't make a contribution. We're all capable of something. When I'm thinking through these type of future world experiences, I think of all these levels of salience of the experience. Like there's a planetarium at Cal Academy that I go to with my daughter before they closed it for COVID, but they have these 20-minute movies that are just remarkable. Like you go in there and there's all like the lights, and it's this amazing experience, and it looks really three-dimensional. There's one where you go into the ocean and you learn all about like climate change, and there's another one about outer space. And I think, I really have to pitch to them to do like an eco-city version, a biophilic cities version of this, and how, I mean, I feel like so emotionally moved every time I go into the planetarium, and I've watched the same movie probably like 20 times at this planetarium with my daughter. It's just as good every single time. So like a planetarium experience. Then you've got audio. I did a guided meditation to try and encourage people to take action to change the world that you do in a meditation state where I don't know much about neuroscience, but I think you have different brain waves when you meditate. There's watching things on a TV screen, like a video, there's reading a script, there's Magic Leap, like augmented reality glasses where you could see something, VR or AR, which is quite incredible. I've tried them on and used them before. So you've got levels of depth of the experience. Like you mentioned before that when people write it up themselves, they have a certain type of experience that's better than if they just read it written down. I mean, how much do you think the immersive salience of the experience matters? Like, does it matter a lot? Like, should we really be pitching for like $1 million to make it like a hyper super immersive like planetarium AR thing, which could be really, really amazing and people are just like life changed, or do you think like simpler versions are enough? And part of the reason I ask this, partly because I would love to build this stuff, but I asked a similar question of another guy who studies whether you get like smiley or frowny faces depending on your electricity consumption. And I'd always thought that if you had like not just a smiley or frowny face, but a super amazing character, like it had eyes and it danced, and I could get like Pixar to make one by the world's best artists. And he just said no. He said that the part of the brain is so primitive that interprets like, am I liked or am I not liked? Whether you make like a hand-drawn smiley face or whether you make like this super incredible emotive character, like it's probably just going to have the same effect. So I'm kind of asking you the same question. Like, does I mean, I don't know, you haven't actually studied this yet, but what's your hunch as to like how out there we should get with how immersive these experiences can be?
I'll leave it to the neuroscientist to tell me all the nuts and bolts of how it affects the brain. That's far outside my expertise. But I mean, in terms of generating the cognitive alternatives, I do think that an immersive experience is going to increase this. And I think to some degree, we've already seen that in our recent experiments that are not published yet, where the most immersive one we have is where people are generating them for themselves. But I certainly view that as more immersive than if you're just reading, say, a list of cognitive alternatives that other people have come up with and relayed to us through interviews. One doesn't really require any thinking. It's maybe just more passive reading. One really requires you to put your brain to work and imagine what these things are going to look like and then relay that information to us. We're talking right now about taking it a step further in two ways. I mean, one, now that I'm like finding out there's all these brilliant images that people have already created that are all over Google that you can look at it. And you put me in contact with the architect that does some of these drawings as well. I'm making a
circle. I'm finding them all, making a club, making a future vision club.
So we're already looking at utilizing just more imagery, because right now the extent to which we've really used images is pretty bland. I mean, I sent you the images we've used. They're not that exciting, but they're better than nothing. I think we could do a better job there and test that and compare that to the individual generation of these things. And then additionally, I mean, we are looking at virtual reality as a method, but I'm not sure yet if somebody has created. But like you've mentioned, I love the idea of doing the eco city, but where it's actually involved and it's 3D. You're walking through the city, you're seeing all these buildings on the streets. There's other people in the virtual world. You're interacting with them almost like a game. You can even create it to be a game. I mean, it's not something like Grand Theft Auto, but like kind of like Grand Theft Auto, where you're running around in the city, you're navigating this world, you're engaging in various tasks, hopefully pro-environmental tasks, not the stuff you do in that particular game. But I think that would be more immersive. And I think that what we would get out of that is we'd see larger effects on the individuals in terms of the three outcomes that we've been looking at: identification with environmental activists, willingness to engage in these various collective pro-environmental behaviors, and then probably greater likelihood of engaging in whatever the behavior that we utilize is. And again, we've used the writing the letters in the past, but there's other ways to do it, things like donating money or participating in rallies and so forth. I think it would, my hunch would be that you would get larger effects on these outcomes that we're interested in, the more immersive the experience is. So long as the experience is showing people alternative worlds that they haven't already thought of. Because that, for me, I mean, that's the whole point of the cognitive alternatives to begin with. You're showing people a way things could be that doesn't currently exist, and then showing them some specificity and how that world might be achieved. And all of that could be built in to some kind of virtual reality game with an eco city design.
We actually have the next episode that's coming out in a week, which will have been a couple of months past by the time this comes out, is with Naomi Augustin-Yin. She worked for Magic Leap. And so we're actually talking about how to make, you put on the goggles, the AR goggles, so you can still see the real world, but it's like a transparency over the top, and creating these worlds. And that was before I discovered your research. We were just talking about how cool it would be to like see these eco cities. But now that we know about your research, we have a bit more evidence to back up this idea of why that there's actually a very real practical reason for why we should be creating these immersive experiences. And I think the way it sounds like the way, if we were to try to design up the best way to do it, we would show like the current world, because in those animations, those new eco-city animations that are coming out, they have like the old one, and then it starts off all concrete, and then all the trees and all the plants like drop on, and you get this transformation experience, which is really fun to watch. I think way more fun than when you just see it like it's already unified. So you can start with the world is all covered with concrete and it's messy, and then you start to see it to change, which is partly fun, but it also speaks to your research in that we're showing the instability and the illegitimacy of the current world. Like, no, it doesn't have to be that way, and then how we're actually implementing solutions to the new world. But then we want to engage people in the practice of coming up with their own ideas, like sitting down for 20 minutes, write your own ideas so it's not just a one way. They're actually kind of doing part of the problem solving work themselves. So we really have that deeper experience, and then giving them some actual actions they can engage in at the end, not just spitting them back out into the world, but actually like, well, this is what you can do. And then maybe in a group as well, maybe it could be a group thing. I don't know, maybe we get a group and we sit them in a room and give them this immersive experience, and then they write something out, and then maybe they talk to each other about it, and then like pick top 5 things you want to do, write to your senator, install a solar panel, whatever, to kind of like manufacture these experiences. I mean, I'm involved in like the art and design community, and people are trying to come up with creative ways, like creative people who are artists are trying to come up with ideas that they can have a positive influence. And I think if they were to listen to this podcast, and it would really give them some food in how to create these positive experiences that could create a real change.
Yeah, I think what you just described is, as far as I know, sounds in line with best practices for getting people to generate cognitive alternatives. So.
Yeah, we should find some funding and do up something really fancy. See if we can.
If I had $1 million to give you to do it, I'd give it to you.
You know what? It's been on my list to pitch to the California Academy of Sciences to make one for the planetarium. It's been like a crazy idea. And I'm like, I don't know how much they cost to make because they have a whole team of animators and all these partners and all these funders. I'm sure it's a really, really big deal. But I'm written it down on my diary now that I'm going to ask. So you never know what will happen. It could be an A-class immersive experience.
I think that sounds brilliant.
Got to start somewhere. All right. So just to wrap up, what are you most excited about researching in the future?
I mean, what's on our current trajectory is for us testing additional ways of manipulating cognitive alternatives. We want to find there's two things in tandem. We want to find the best way of doing it, but it also has to be a way that is widely applicable to individuals. There could be something to be said for simplicity. If it gets too extravagant, then it becomes most people aren't going to be able to participate. So you do need some more simple ways of doing this. But for us, we're currently testing these, what we think are maybe good manipulations for generating cognitive alternatives, doing that. And then we're also just working theoretically with our model, trying to figure out the ordering of these various effects. If our end game is the outcome of collective pro-environmental behavior, what are all the variables and how are they all integrated that lead people to be more or less likely to engage in these outcomes? So that's kind of where we're going. It's slow process moving forward and connecting all the ideas. But
okay, well, hopefully me and my friends in the practical world can help implement some of it or give you some material. Absolutely. I mean, I'm hoping for Earth Imagination Day. That's what I'm trying to manifest or trying to inspire around people. And it sounds like it can just be so simple. Like you just get a group of school kids, you tell them that this future world is possible, and then you ask them to write down some ideas. Really simple process, could be done at any age, in school, at university, in any professional environment. It kind of almost seems like a one-size-fits-all kind of creative, interesting process to put people through that everybody would get something out of that we're not doing right now. So would you be a fan of Earth Imagination Day?
Sure.
Maybe we could put it through a test.
There's probably something to be said for doing these activities we come up with, but these cognitive alternative activities in grade school. And my hunch would be that doing it earlier is probably better for generating the various behaviors that we're interested in later than doing it exclusively as adults.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are big adult concepts that can be simplified down to a very young age. I've got my girl, she's all down for urban heat islands. She understands all the thermodynamics, all the eco-city stuff. She understands the corals. We went to Mexico recently, and the babysitter who was looking after her, and she only talks to me through the Google Translate, so it talks out in its computerized voice. They come back from the park and she says, her daughter's only 5. She says, "Your daughter is very advanced. She talks about adult things like natural resources and environmental pollution." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, muchas gracias." Yeah. But anyway, so let's say it's 100 years in the future and there was one thing that you could change that you think would make everything better. What would you choose to change?
Oh, I feel like you should have given me this question beforehand. 100 years and I get to change one thing. I don't know.
Okay. For me, it would be environmental data APIs. I have all the environmental data APIs and I could do whatever I want because they're all terrible and they don't work properly. And that would, for example, be my version.
Well, hopefully it doesn't take you 100 years to get there.
You'd be surprised. Our movement is extremely backwards when it comes to technology, like software technology. It's all right. We don't need to answer it. I can end before that. All right. Well, this has been delightful. And I really hope we can encourage more environmental imagination. It's called cognitive alternatives, less exciting name in the academic literature, but we can call it imagination and vision and creativity for future possible worlds. Thanks so much for joining me, Joshua. And I look forward to being able to read more of your research in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.